Acts 13 marks the beginning of Paul's first journey. His first journey of really four major journeys that we read about in the book of Acts. How do you feel about travel? This weekend is a holiday weekend, and so there's a lot of people traveling this weekend. But in tonight's study, what I want to do is I want to consider an overview of Paul's travels. I want to think about his journeys with you. This is actually part 2 of our Wednesday night Bible study. So tonight might feel a little bit more like a geography lecture than it does a preachy sermon. Some of you might appreciate that. But this overview is going to cover the Pauline-related events of Acts chapter 13 through 28. We're just taking a look at a bird's eye view of the journeys. But I want you to appreciate, as we look at this study, the benefit that Paul traveled without the benefit of airplane, without train, without motorboat, and he traveled many miles between AD 47 and AD 68. In the years following his conversion and his early attempts at evangelism in Damascus and in the synagogue at Jerusalem. And as you think about the intense travel that's involved in his preaching journeys, I just want you to appreciate the gritty character and the impenetrable attitude of Paul toward the preaching of the gospel whenever and wherever he could. In a time when churches are preaching less and preachers complain of being overworked, and where we'll hardly even walk across the street sometimes to talk to somebody about the gospel, I think that there are some lessons to be learned when we consider the body of work that the Apostle Paul puts together just so he can share Jesus with the lost world. And if we learn anything tonight, I hope it's the importance of not preaching less, but preaching more so that we're reaching more. And as you think of Paul's missionary journeys, ask yourself, what am I doing to help fulfill the Great Commission? Well, take a look at what Paul did. Let's start with his first journey, which begins around AD 47 to 49, somewhere in there, and begins in Acts chapter 13 and verse 1. Some of the travelers that would have gone along with Paul for that first journey would have been Paul himself. He took Barnabas with him, and then they took along John Mark. And the main route would be Cyprus and Turkey. The distance that they traveled was about 1,400 miles. To try to get that into perspective here in the U.S., that would be about a round trip from Florence, Alabama to Houston, Texas. Or if you're more familiar with the trip from Florence, Alabama to Tampa, Florida, that's about a 1,400-mile round trip. Now, keep in mind, he does this without a car that drives 70 miles an hour, without an airplane, does it without some of the luxuries that we have in our world today. A 1,400-mile trip, and this is the shortest one of all of his 4 journeys. It starts in Antioch in Syria, and we read in Acts 13 that the Holy Spirit sets apart Paul and Barnabas to preach the word of God there in Acts chapter 13 and verse 2. John Mark, we read in verse 5, goes along as their helper. He's their assistant, the text says. And so they set off from Antioch to the seaport at Seleucia. This is a picture of Antioch, which is in modern-day Turkey today. Antioch is the third, would have been at this time during the Roman Empire, the third largest city in the Roman Empire, behind Rome itself and behind Alexandria in Egypt. So this is a large city, probably about 750,000 people living in this city. This is where Paul takes off from, and oftentimes this is where he comes back to. This is sort of home base for many of his journeys. And so they head off to the seaport at Seleucia. We're just going to keep going back and forth to this map a little bit, but you can see they head off to Seleucia here. They go then to Salamis and Paphos, and these are 2 cities that are on the island of Cyprus. So they sail from Seleucia 80 miles to Salamis and Paphos, and this is on Cyprus, which is in the Mediterranean Sea. You read about that in Acts chapter 13 and verse 6. Now, when they're in Paphos, maybe you remember that's on the west coast of Cyprus, Paul confronts a sorcerer. His name is Elymas, and he blinds him. He's getting tired of this sorcerer, and so he blinds him there in Acts 13, verses 6 through 12. And from this point on, this is when the Bible starts calling Paul Paul and not Saul. So from this point forward, he will be called Paul when you read the Acts chapter 13 text. Again, taking a look at the map, if you can see this, we go from Antioch to Salamis and to Paphos. And I'm not sure if that's how that's showing up there. Yeah, there we go. So Antioch, wow, it's going to take forever. I do this with every single map, though. Salamis to Paphos. From Paphos, they go to Perga, which is in Pamphylia. Now, John Mark deserts the group when you read Acts chapter 13 and verse 13, and returns to Jerusalem. I don't know. Maybe I sympathize with John Mark a little bit. After all, if my coworkers started blinding people while we were on a trip, maybe I would think, I don't know if I want to keep hanging out with you. And so he goes home. And there's some hard feelings about that later when they begin to take another journey. But Barnabas and Paul travel on to Perga in Pamphylia, which is Turkey today, and then on to Antioch in Pisidia. So continue to follow the map. If you can see that red arrow there, we're at Paphos there on the west side of Cyprus. And then you follow that map and you head up into Perga in Pamphylia. And they then go to Antioch of Pisidia. So we have to separate the Antiochs. There's an Antioch in Syria that he starts from, and then he goes to Antioch of Pisidia. Paul skillfully preaches Jesus in his longest recorded sermon in Acts 13. Acts 13 is the longest sermon of Paul that you'll find in the Acts account. Many people respond to Paul in Acts chapter 13, 48 and 49. A lot of people become believers, but the Jewish leaders start to get jealous of Paul, just like they started to get jealous of Jesus when they saw his popularity. And so the Jewish leaders drive them out of the city, and they're driven out of the city. They go to start focusing on the Gentiles. And the Gentiles hear gladly. Many people become believers as you read Acts chapter 13. And yet Paul, because he's driven out of the city, has to leave Antioch. And they travel, Paul and Barnabas travel down to Iconium from there, to read about in verse 51. So taking a look at where that red line ends in Antioch of Pisidia, follow it over to Iconium a few miles. Now, in Iconium, which is 90 miles away, so again, no small journey when you don't have a car. It's going to take a while to get 90 miles away, but there's a great number of Jews and Greeks who become believers. Paul and Barnabas, they start in the synagogue, that's their practice, and then they go to the city and begin preaching in the city. Eventually, however, more plots forced them to flee 40 miles to Lystra, which is in the province of Lycaonia, which you read about in Acts chapter 14. So follow that arrow again. Here we are in Iconium, and we're moving just down 40 miles to Lystra's next stop. Now, when Paul heals a lame man, the townspeople think that he and Barnabas are Greek gods. And maybe you remember that episode where people think this must be the gods have come down to us in human form. And Paul and Barnabas tear their clothes. They tell the people not to worship them. And then Jews from Antioch, after that episode, stir up the crowd again. These Jews are following Paul around from city to city and trying to stop his work. And Paul is stoned there and left for dead. Paul survives, though, and the next day he goes 20 miles south to Derbe. Goes 20 miles south and preaches in Derbe after being stoned and left for dead. That's pretty impressive to me. You should think about Paul. So he goes south, he's over to Derbe, and then while in Derbe, Paul preaches in relative peace. Many disciples are added to the church. And on the return trip to Antioch in Syria, they're headed home now. But Paul and Barnabas pass through Lystra, Iconium, Antioch of Pisidia, Pamphylia, Perga, and Attalia. And one of the things that's noted in Acts 14 is that they appoint elders in the churches they helped plant. I want you to notice how quickly they appoint elders in some of these churches that they helped plant. This is a pretty quick turnaround from starting churches in some of these cities and then just a few, perhaps weeks later, appointing elders in those churches. And then they get back to Antioch in Syria. So they return to Antioch. When they get back, they report what God had done. They report how he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. It's also while in Antioch that Paul writes a letter to Christians in Galatia. And so his letter to the Galatians would have been one of his first letters that he wrote. And so we're going to kind of point out where along the way Paul would have written some of the letters that he wrote in some of the epistles. In AD 49, Paul and Barnabas leave for Jerusalem via Phoenicia and Samaria. Here's a different map that maybe is a little less congested, but you see the outbound trip is in the red line, which when they leave out of Antioch of Syria, go through Cyprus, head up to Perga and Pamphylia, and then the dark blue line is the return trip back to Antioch. Now, they're going to go down to Jerusalem, and they go down to Jerusalem because notice they've converted a lot of Gentiles. And some of the Jews are getting upset that they've converted Gentiles, but they haven't told some of these Gentiles that they need to be circumcised to be saved. So they go to Jerusalem to have this council, this conversation, to figure out whether indeed it is required that someone be circumcised in addition to obeying the gospel to be saved. And so that in AD 49 takes place, where Paul and Barnabas meet with the leaders of the Jerusalem church. And some people would refer to this as the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15, verses 1 through 35. Now, at the Jerusalem Council, the apostles and other disciples, they have a discussion as to whether or not the Gentile believers need to be circumcised. And after a heated argument from Paul, and it's pretty clear, Paul's pretty hot about this. He's upset that people are requiring this. But after a heated argument from Paul and Barnabas and Peter and James, all of these people speak in this council. The council decides they are not going to burden the Gentiles by requiring circumcision. And so that is now out of bounds officially as they have met together and revealed the will of God to the people. From there, now that that's solved, Paul is going to go on his second preaching journey, which would have taken place between AD 49 and AD 51. And that begins in Acts chapter 15 and verse 36. And again, we see him kind of leaving out of Antioch. But Paul, Silas on this trip, we've got Paul, we've got Silas, we've got Timothy, we have Luke, we have Priscilla and Aquila. All of these are some of the key travelers on this trip. So we have some different characters who are part of this second journey. The main route here is going to be through Syria, through Turkey. Now they're going to visit Greece as well, and then they're going to also be in Jerusalem. And this is a 2,800-mile trip. The last one was 1,400 miles. This is double the mileage that we're going to see Paul traveling when he takes the second journey. All right. So Paul, Barnabas, Judas called Barsabbas, and Silas, they were in Jerusalem to have this council, and they traveled back to Antioch. They go to Antioch to tell the people in Antioch the official results of their Jerusalem meeting, which was, hey, good news, you don't have to be circumcised to be saved. Everybody rejoices, especially the males, and they take a letter there and share it with them, and everybody is happy about the conclusion of this. So Paul and Barnabas decide they're going to visit the churches again. So they meet with the church in Antioch, and they say, let's go on another journey. But they disagree here about who should go with them, because remember, John Mark had left the trip. And Paul doesn't want to take John Mark again. He says, he left me the first time. I don't want to take him a second time and get left again. And so Paul takes Silas and Barnabas takes John Mark, and they go two different directions. And the book of Acts follows Paul's journey specifically from that point forward. Paul doesn't want to take John Mark. Barnabas takes him, and Barnabas goes to Cyprus. And that's documented in Acts 15, verse 39. Paul takes Silas on that second journey. Well, here's where they go. Paul and Silas leave Antioch and Syria. They visit Derbe. We've already been to Derbe. They visit Lystra, and they visit Iconium, and they're on their way to Troas. While visiting these churches, it's also important to note this is where Timothy joins them. So young Timothy, the one that Paul wrote first in 2 Timothy 2, this is where Timothy starts to get mentored and tutored, if you will, by Paul while Timothy's traveling with him on these journeys. Take a look at the map. Again, this red line is going to proceed out of Antioch. And then notice here we are in Troas on this coastline near the Aegean Sea. In Troas, which is a seaport city, Paul has a vision of a man from Macedonia calling him to come. Maybe you've heard the song. This is a song I did not understand when I was a kid. We have heard the Macedonian call today. I had no idea, singing that song over and over again, what the Macedonian call was, because I just wasn't as familiar with this text as I should have been. But the Macedonian call is the call of someone from Macedonia asking Paul to come, as Paul had a vision, to come and to preach to them. And this is how Paul gets over to Greece. In Acts 16 and verse 10, you're also going to notice that this is the first time that the word we gets used. And what that indicates, since Luke is the author of Acts, it indicates that Luke is now with Paul. Before Acts chapter 16, verse 10, Luke would say they. So he is writing as if he is not among them. He is just writing about their travels, but now he is with them in their travels. So the pronoun switches from a they to a we, because Luke has joined the trip as well at this point. Now from Troas, Paul travels to Philippi, and he passes through Samothrace and Neapolis on his way to Philippi. Philippi is named after Philip of Macedon. And so we can kind of figure out where Macedonia gets its name from, Philip of Macedon, and then Philippi gets its name from Philip of Macedon. All right, so he's in Troas. Look at the end of that red line, and it's going to move. There we go. Now we have gone across the sea, because Paul has got the Macedonian call, and now he is over in Philippi at this point. In Philippi, he meets Lydia, and you read about her in Acts chapter 16. She's a wealthy businesswoman, and she is converted, and the group stays in her house for a little while in Philippi. Well, while they're there, there's a fortune-telling slave girl who's converted, and her owners start a riot because the fortune-telling slave girl is no longer making them money. Paul and Silas are thrown into jail, and you remember they're singing praises while they're in jail, and then we have an earthquake. In the middle of the night, they're singing praises to God, and there is an earthquake in that jail, and that's when the Philippian jailer comes into the scene. The Philippian jailer asks, what do I need to do to be saved? And Paul has the opportunity to explain to him what he must do. So he believes in Jesus, he is baptized, and he is converted. When the magistrate discovers that Paul and Silas are Roman citizens, he actually apologizes to them, and they are escorted out of town. Here's just a picture, I think that's interesting, of ruins of the jail at Philippi. There's a few pictures here that kind of show that some of these places you can still visit, you can still tour, you can find certain remnants and certain archaeological finds that confirm some of these places existed that Paul visited. All right. After being escorted out of Philippi, then Paul, Silas, and others, they travel through Amphipolis and Apollonia, and they're on their way to Thessalonica. And so chapter 17 begins this time that Paul spends with the church in Thessalonica. Follow that red line again. We're in Philippi. That was our last stop. But take a look at the end of that red line in Philippi, and we are going south over to Thessalonica after visiting Amphipolis and Apollonia. In Thessalonica, guess who's following Paul? Jews. Jews form a mob, and they try to arrest Paul and Silas, but instead they arrest several believers when you read Acts 17, verses 5 through 9. Paul and Silas, because obviously people are trailing them, Paul and Silas are sent to Berea before the mob discovers where they are. This is a picture of the Via Ignatia, which was an important east-west Roman highway that passed through Thessalonica. And again, there's still ruins of perhaps the road that Paul himself would have traveled during this time. Take a look at the end of that red line there, and we're in Thessalonica, and we are moving down to Berea, just south. Now, the people in the synagogue in Berea, they received the message eagerly. We quote Acts 17 and verse 11 all the time, right? You know, that these people were more fair-minded than those in Thessalonica because they received the word with all readiness, and they were ready to hear it. They checked what he said, and if they confirmed what he said, they followed it. And so they were a great example for all hearers in Berea. And when the Jews in Thessalonica discovered that Paul is preaching in Berea, they came to stir up trouble there as well. So again, Jews are following Paul from city to city. That's one of the reasons he's having to move from city to city to try to escape the trouble that they're stirring up. Silas and Timothy stay in Berea there. Really, Paul is public enemy number one, and so they're chasing him and following him, and Silas and Timothy stay there while Paul travels by ship this time, and he's traveling over to Athens. When he gets to Athens in Acts chapter 17, his heart is stirred up because he sees the idolatry of Athens. You remember that in Acts 17? And he begins to preach to the people of Athens on Mars Hill or at the Areopagus. He sees an altar there that's to the unknown God, and he preaches to the thinkers of Athens there in verses 23 through 31. This is a picture of the Acropolis of Athens, which again, you can still visit, tour Athens. I know the Olympics were there within the past few years. And so some of these things got a lot of press there when the Olympics were in Greece at one point in time. But this is the Acropolis of Athens, which would have been standing during Paul's time there as well. After Paul's preaching, a number of the philosophers believe. Some people mock him, they don't believe, but some people do believe. And that was impressive that he got some people there in a city like Athens to believe. Several believers join Paul, in fact, and they leave for Corinth. So he leaves Athens and he goes to Corinth. So here we are in Athens at the end of that red line. And he's going to move just a little bit over the strait here into Corinth. Now, people try to get Paul arrested in Corinth, and they bring him before Gallio, the proconsul of Achaia. And Gallio refuses to press charges against Paul. He can see that some of these accusers are up to no good. They don't hate him for an honest legal reason. And so he refuses to press charges against Paul. This is the bema at Corinth that you see a picture of, that perhaps the platform where Paul was brought before Gallio. And again, if you were to tour Corinth, this might be an area where you would try to go see. This stone inscription that you see here, this is at Delphi in Greece. It mentions a Roman governor or proconsul named Gallio of the province of Achaia. And the name Gallio there is highlighted on that stone. Once again, proving that some of these characters who are involved in these legal proceedings when Paul was in certain cities, that they can be proved with archaeology that they did indeed exist. And so this is real history taking place at a real time in the first century. Well, while in Corinth, I think we also should point out, Paul writes 2 letters to Christians in Thessalonica. So we noted that he wrote the letter to the Galatians, and now he's writing 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, which were, again, some of the earlier letters that Paul wrote, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And there in Corinth, he meets Aquila and Priscilla, who are also tent makers, and so he's helping basically make some money to support some of the work that he's doing by making tents with them. And he's also found some friends among Aquila and Priscilla. And they leave for Cenchrea as you read chapter 18, verse 18. Take a look at that red line. Again, we're going to go from Corinth and we're going to go down to Cenchrea, just a jot. In Cenchrea, Paul gets his hair cut because he had taken a vow. There's not a lot of other details given there, but it is mentioned that he'd taken a vow and he had to cut his hair in Acts 18 and verse 18. And Paul then, along with Priscilla and Aquila, they set sail from Cenchrea and they go to Ephesus in chapter 18 and verse 19. So here we are headed to Ephesus. And in Ephesus, Paul reasons with the Jews. They ask him to stay longer, but Paul declines. Now on the next trip, he's going to stay there for over 2 years. But on this first trip, he just makes a visit to Ephesus, has some quick conversations, declines to stay for a long period of time, just stays for a short time. And so we go from Cenchrea, we go across the sea over to Ephesus. That's where he is now. Paul leaves Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus, though, so they stay. And he sets sail for Caesarea in Syria and in Jerusalem. To the right is a model of Diana, who was the goddess of Ephesus. And of course, she comes into play in Acts chapter 19, because there's a lot of people who make statues of Diana. That's how they make their money. And this would be an image of that Diana, one of their idols. After visiting the churches in these areas, Paul returns to his home base in Antioch. So remember we said he usually leaves from Antioch and he comes back home to Antioch. And that's true in the first and the second journeys. And so he goes back to Antioch. Here's again a bigger picture map that kind of help you see just how far he traveled. And again, without airplane, without car, having to do all this perhaps by horse, chariot, boat. This would have taken a long time to make these types of journeys. It would have been extremely exhausting and tiring and difficult. Now, we got his third journey, okay? So his third journey takes place between AD 52 to AD 57. The travelers there are Paul and Silas. Silas is along again. We've got Timothy. We have Luke. Perhaps there's others who are mentioned as well. And the main route is Turkey. He goes to Greece. He goes to Lebanon. And he's going to end up in in Israel. This is a 2,700-mile trip. If you want to think about the distance of 2,700 miles from a United States perspective, that would be like taking a trip from Washington, D.C. on the far east coast all the way to Los Angeles, California on the far west coast. That's a long trip. I wouldn't want to take that trip, even in a car, let alone a chariot or a wagon or whatever it is he was riding along in. That's a long distance to be traveling. All right. He decides to visit the churches that he helped plant on his 2 former journeys. So he likes to go check back in, see how churches are doing. I think that's an important point because it tells us some trips that Paul took are for evangelism. He's trying to teach the gospel to the lost. Some trips are for edification. He's checking in on people who are already believers, and he's trying to help them continue in their faith in being believers. Not all missionary trips or evangelistic trips are always to start new churches. Sometimes it's to try to help solidify existing churches and help them, encourage them to stand for the truth. On his way to Ephesus, he passes through Galatia and Phrygia. And he strengthens the disciples on his way. So again, we're starting out of Antioch. Notice here we are in the area of going through Galatia and Phrygia. He ends up in Ephesus, and he stays in Ephesus for 2 years. Now, it's when he's in Ephesus that he writes a letter to the Corinthians. So we've got the letter to the Galatians written. We've got the letters to 1st and 2nd Thessalonians written. And now we have 1st Corinthians being written. And he wrote that from Ephesus, as you read Acts chapter 19 and references to it in 1 Corinthians. Ephesus is a major port city, and silversmiths make their money by selling idols to visitors. And so many people convert that the silversmiths who manufacture idols start a riot because they're afraid if people keep converting, we're going to be out of a job. Because if you put an end to idolatry, you put an end to the idols. And if you put an end to the idols, you put an end to the idol makers who are making the idols. And if you put an end to the idol makers, we're out of a job. So we've got to stop this Paul guy. We've got to quit getting him to preach. We've got to start. He needs to be quiet. All right. The silversmiths demand a hearing in the theater. And what you see here in the picture is the theater where Paul was taken during the riot of the silversmiths. That's a pretty big, intimidating place. And so Paul's in the center of that, the center of attention in this large theater. And the city clerk puts down the riot in Acts chapter 19. After the riot, Paul leaves and he travels through Macedonia and into Greece again. And while traveling, Paul writes letters to the Christians in Corinth. So here's where 2 Corinthians comes in. He's perhaps taking a long time as he travels, so he writes 2 Corinthians. And he also writes Romans while he's on this 3rd journey. When Paul reaches Greece, he decides to return to Syria by going back through Philippi and on to Troas. So perhaps visiting with some of these brethren that he'd gotten to know in Philippi and Troas on previous trips. So again, you follow the red line. Well, that's a lot of travel right there on that one point. So he's back in Troas, and this is where Paul preaches until midnight and the guy falls asleep. Everybody remembers that story. But Paul's preaching. There's a man named Eutychus. He falls asleep. He falls from a 3rd-story window, and he dies. And Paul revives him. Paul leaves Troas after just spending a few days there, and he travels through Assos, Mytilene, Samos on his way to Miletus in Acts chapter 20. And it's at Miletus that the Ephesian elders come to Paul, and he gives his final speech to them in Acts chapter 20 at Miletus. Church elders meet him at his ship at Miletus. They cry, they embrace one another. Paul offers final words of encouragement. He knows this is probably the last time they're going to see each other. And then Paul departs. He tells them during this speech he expects to be in prison in Jerusalem. He knows what's ahead of him. He's probably going to go to prison. There's probably a good chance he's not going to see their face anymore. And from Miletus, he sails to Kos, to Rhodes, to Patara, and straight through to Tyre. So again, follow that red line. We were in Miletus here, just south of Ephesus, and now we're going to be traveling through several coastal places as his ship makes its way back to home base, if you will. Now, he's in Tyre this time, and his ship docks in Tyre, so he stays with some disciples while he's in Tyre. and people are hospitable to him wherever he goes. He's well known, and they know that he's doing the Lord's work, and so oftentimes he finds places to stay with brethren. The disciples there, they warn him, don't go to Jerusalem. Everybody hates you in Jerusalem. You were a Jew. You converted to Christianity. You can't go back to Jerusalem. Everybody knows who you were. This is where you were raised. This is where you were taught by Gamaliel. People don't like you. So this isn't smart. And yet, Paul leaves and travels 30 miles to Ptolemais on to Caesarea, and he has every intention to go to Jerusalem, even if it leads to his death. He's not afraid to go to Jerusalem. He's not afraid to die. And he continues his journey south to Jerusalem. He goes to Caesarea first, and a prophet there predicts that Paul is going to be imprisoned and handed over to the Gentiles. But it doesn't stop him. Paul says he's ready to face the trials, and he leaves for Jerusalem. So travels down from Caesarea down to Jerusalem, and then the travelers report to the church leaders everything God had done. It starts off well. Paul gets there, tells the church leaders, this is where I've been. Here's all my journeys. Can you imagine just Paul talking about all the places that he'd been, all the people that he'd seen, all the trials that he'd overcome? I would think that'd be incredibly interesting to listen to that report. The leaders praise God. They're happy for what Paul has done. But they urge Paul to participate in a purification ritual at the temple because they're trying to counteract rumors that Christianity is anti-Jewish. And so they're trying basically not to help Paul not get killed. So they're trying to accommodate some of the traditions of Judaism, trying to help other Jews who are accusing him see that he's not completely anti-Jewish. There are certain things he doesn't practice anymore, but they're not necessarily things that he's making an issue of, and he participates in that purification rite. Doesn't stop them, though. They still hate him, and they're still going to punish him. And so, because of that, Paul is going to have to journey to Rome. And that'll be his fourth journey as you follow the journeys of Paul in Scripture. Now, on this journey, Paul's with the Roman guards because they're there. He's under arrest, and he's traveling so that he can go to trial in Rome because he's appealed to Caesar. So he's with the Roman guards. He's with Luke. He's with others as well. And the main route here would be Israel, Lebanon, Turkey, Crete, Malta, Sicily, Italy. Really not a bad tour if you can get it, but you would probably rather not do it as a prisoner. But these are some of the places that he's going to stop. There's 2,250 miles this trip, and that's a one-way trip. This isn't a trip to Rome and back. This is a trip to Rome, and then it's going to stop there. Now, he is going to get to travel a little bit after Rome, and we're going to look at that in a minute. But this would be, as you look at it, this would be his trip from Jerusalem up to Caesarea, leaving the port in Sidon, crossing over Cyprus, and then all the way up, finally, to Rome. There's a lot of things that happen in between, though. Well, first of all, he's in Jerusalem. And while he's in Jerusalem, the Roman commander arrests him to save him from a Jewish mob. If the Roman commander hadn't arrested him, the mob themselves would have killed Paul. There was just too many people. And so he's actually put under arrest to protect him because he would have been killed otherwise. When the commander learns of a death threat against Paul, he orders an armed escort take him to Caesarea. So they take Paul very quickly and secretly to Caesarea because there were people who had made a vow they were going to kill Paul before the day was over, and they weren't going to eat until they'd killed him. And so this group departs for Caesarea and pass through Antipatris along the way. If this was turned into a movie in modern day, this would be kind of cool, actually. You'd have these armed guards, and you'd have, the mob chasing down the protected guy that was under arrest, and you'd have these. Anyway, it'd be fun. I'll stop now. In Caesarea, Paul is tried before Felix. God had told Paul, you're going to stand, through Ananias, God had told Paul, you're going to stand before kings. And you're going to give your testimony to kings, to rulers. And all this is coming true through these events. So Paul is tried before Felix, who is the governor of Judea in Acts 24. This is the theater in Caesarea at the time of Paul that you see to the right here. Felix leaves Paul in prison for 2 years. He's hoping that by leaving Paul in prison, because Paul's a pretty high-profile criminal, he's going to get a bribe. He's going to get some money out of it, so maybe he could release him, and that doesn't happen. And then he's tried again before Festus, who was appointed governor to replace Felix. The Jews try to get Paul transferred to Jerusalem because they want to have him killed there, but that doesn't happen. Paul demands, because he knows he doesn't want to go back to Jerusalem, he demands his right as a Roman citizen. He wants to appeal his case to Caesar. And if you're going to appeal your case to Caesar, well, you got to go to the capital city of the Roman Empire to do that. You've got to go to Rome. And that's why they're going to take him to Rome, so that he can make his appeal to the highest court and stand before Caesar. King Agrippa, while he's there, visits Festus. Paul appears before him as well. It's documented in Acts 25 through Acts chapter 26 and verse 32. Agrippa finds no fault in Paul. This reminds us a lot of Jesus. When Jesus stood before Pontius Pilate, I find no fault in this man. And when Paul stood before Agrippa, Agrippa says the same thing. I don't find any fault in him. And he says if he hadn't appealed to the emperor, he would have released him, because there isn't really any grounds for arrest here. Paul is placed under the charge of his centurion. A little side point that I would know, whenever you read through the book of Acts, almost every centurion's a good guy. Sometimes we like to paint people who are soldiers and military people, sometimes people like to paint them in bad light. The centurions are always really good people when you read through the book of Acts. And I think that's impressive as you read through it. But Paul is placed under the charge of a centurion named Julius. And then he is sent to Sidon so that he can set sail for Rome there in Acts chapter 27. So he's in Caesarea, and he's going to head just up the coast to Sidon. That's going to be the place where they're port, and they leave to go across the sea. Now, the centurion in charge of Paul lets him visit with friends in Sidon, and they board a ship and set sail for Italy. So it's kind of like Paul's got an ankle bracelet on, right? He's allowed to roam. They want to keep an eye on him, but he's given a lot of freedom and a lot of luxury while he is under arrest. So then they board the ship, they set sail for Italy, and the ship stops at Myra in Lycia, and the centurion finds an Alexandrian ship. This is a huge ship, probably a cargo ship, and so almost like a barge, a very heavy ship. So it's going to be moving very slowly through the sea. And Paul is placed on board this ship, and the ship sails to Fair Havens, which is near the city of Lasea. Again, follow our map here, and we are in Sidon. And notice here where we have gone, over to Fair Havens, which is on the island of Crete. Paul recommends that the ship stay in safe harbor. Paul's done some sailing. Paul's experienced. He says it's probably because of the time of year, because this is when the storms start to come in and the currents start to rise and things like that. It's probably good that we stay here and winter here and wait before we move on to try to sail to Rome. But the centurion does not listen. He orders the ship to sail on. The centurion hopes to harbor for the winter in the city of Phoenix, but you got a northeaster that drives the ship past the island of Clauda, and now they're out in the open sea. And they are there for a long time. Notice the arrow. Yeah, that's where they are. They're just in the middle of the sea, being blown around by a storm because they can't get to a port. They can't get to land. The ship is pounded by a storm for weeks, and the crew throws cargo and tackle overboard. After suffering for several days, the crew begins to lose hope, doesn't think that they're ever going to find land. Paul assures them they're all going to be saved, but they can't abandon ship or they will all die. And so Paul encourages everyone to eat, to gain strength for the shipwreck, because there is going to be a wreck, but it's going to wreck on close enough to land that they can all be rescued. So the ship runs ashore on the island of Malta, which is just south of Sicily. And everyone on the ship makes it ashore safely, just as Paul had promised. So here we are. We've been out on this storm, and they end up wrecking near the island of Malta. While they're on the island of Malta, Paul's putting wood on a campfire, and he's bitten by a venomous snake, but it doesn't harm him. And that's a sign to the people there that there's something special about Paul and concerning about Paul at the same time. But they winter on Malta, and Paul heals people of the island by laying hands on them. And after 3 months, they sail to Syracuse on a ship, and they winter on the island of Syracuse. And after 3 days in Syracuse, they sail to Rhegium, and then on to Puteoli. Take a look at that red line. They're on Malta right now. And now they're sailing up the coast of Italy. And then finally, from Puteoli, they're going to get to Rome. Paul stays with believers 7 days in Puteoli. And from Puteoli, Paul travels through API Forum and 3 taverns where he is met by Christians there. And after seeing the other believers, Paul takes courage and he enters Rome. So here we are in Rome. And that is where his fourth journey is going to end. He remains under house arrest for 2 years in Rome, where he writes letters. Now, this is important as you think about, if you're looking at the chronology of when letters were written. He writes letters to Christians in Ephesus, so he writes Ephesians. He writes Colossians, he writes to Colossae. He writes to Philippi, so he writes Philippians. He also writes to his friend Philemon. So Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon are all written from Rome and have later dates than the ones we've already mentioned. Well, there's some other journeys too, because Paul's released. And we don't know exactly where these journeys were, so I'm just going to go over this quickly. But after 2 years of house arrest, Paul is released and travels again. And we don't know the order of his travels, but we do know, based upon a few references in Scripture, that he went again to Troas. He writes his first letter to Timothy, probably from Troas. Timothy was a preacher in Ephesus, so that's when 1 Timothy is probably written, sometime after his release from Rome. We also know that he left his cloak and some parchments with a man named Carpus, because he's mentioned in 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 13. And so he's in Troas, and Paul's cold, and he wants his cloak, and he wants his parchments. From Troas, perhaps he goes to Miletus. He leaves Trophimus there. He's mentioned in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 20. Trophimus was a fellow missionary with Paul. He was a Gentile from Ephesus. That's mentioned again in 2 Timothy as well. And then from Miletus, he probably went to Corinth. So he went back to Corinth, travels through Crete on his way to Greece. He leaves Titus in Crete. That's how Titus got on Crete. And in Corinth, he leaves Erastus. So now Paul knows that his time is perhaps short, so he's leaving certain preachers in certain locales to start doing the work of an evangelist in some of those places. So Titus is in Crete, Erastus is in Corinth, and he writes his letter to Titus after he leaves Erastus. Erastus is the director of public works in Corinth. He's a helper of Paul there as well. That's important because this is an inscription containing Erastus's name. It was found in 1929. So again, archaeological evidence that this individual named Erastus was a real individual, and it's confirmed with archaeology. Well, they go to Nicopolis. He would have traveled to Nicopolis and spent a winter there. That's noted in Titus 3 and verse 12 before he headed back to Rome. Paul wanted to go to Spain. He says this in Romans 15 verse 28. He wanted to take the gospel all the way to Spain in order to continue to spread the gospel to the ends of the earth. And yet I don't think Paul ever got that chance, because once in Rome, Paul would write a second letter to Timothy, and that's the last letter that we would ever find in our inspired scriptures, because Paul was beheaded in Rome in AD 68 while Nero was the emperor of Rome. This is one of the last things that Paul said in 2 Timothy chapter 4, as he wrote that last letter. He said, "I have fought the good fight." You see everything that he did, all the travels that he made, all the persecution that he faced, all of it because he was a firm believer in the resurrected Jesus. So when he writes this last letter, he says, "I've fought the good fight, and I've finished the race, and I've kept the faith. And now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing." And then we would no longer have another letter from the Apostle Paul. The last letter that Timothy perhaps ever received is Paul saying, "I'm ready. I'm tired. And I'm ready to go home." What are some things we can learn from Paul's journeys? Well, 3 things. This is the preachy part in 2 minutes. Number 1, God can empower you to move beyond your sinful past. Paul, the chief of sinners, and yet this is everything that Paul did in serving the Lord. Number 2, Paul's efforts proved that he was unashamed of the gospel. There was nowhere he wasn't willing to go. He was willing to talk to anyone. He was willing to go anywhere, even if going there would lead to persecution and trials and problems. He was not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. What do our efforts say about us? Are we ashamed of the gospel? Too afraid to speak up, to talk up, to go somewhere? Tell our friends about Jesus. And the last thing is just this: not even chains could stop Paul from preaching. We get a little threatened. We get a little insulted by somebody and we'll be quiet. We'll cower away. Paul, when you read 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9, he says that he's writing from chains, and he says the gospel is not chained, though. And you can put me in chains, but I've still got a pen and I've still got paper, and I'm still going to talk to people about Jesus. Not even chains could stop him from preaching. And so it's my hope that just seeing the body of work, the zeal and the passion, the perseverance of Paul, that it might spur someone, hopefully all of us, to think more seriously about ourselves. Are we truly working for the Lord and passionate about supporting those who are doing this type of work? Are we looking for open doors to share the gospel with family and with friends? Are we using God's precious moments? Have we allowed disappointment or discouragement at some point to stop us from sharing the soul-saving gospel? There's so much work to do for the kingdom. And so let's stay busy sharing heaven's hope with a world that has their head down rather than their eyes up and focused on glory. Have you been focusing on the glory that is to come, or are you focusing more on the temporary trials that you might face here because of your life of faith in Jesus? Let's keep our eyes focused on where Christ is, at the right hand of God, because that's where we want to be. That's where we want everybody else to be. And we've got to share the gospel for that to happen. If you're here tonight and you don't yet have that hope yet, well, we're about to sing an invitation song. And if there's some way that we can help you this evening, we would invite you to come so we can help you get there while we stand and while we sing.